Well, you're all in for a really incredible treat today. For those of you who have found yourself giving up, losing hope, because the addiction has just hijacked your loved one's brain, join us for the next hour. We talked to William Moyers, who has an incredible story of 4 rehabs and just this horrific addiction to crack cocaine that he finally got a handle on and has been in 30 plus years of recovery at this point. This is an inspiring hour full of a wide-ranging conversation with an advocate for those who are dealing with addiction. And he carries a powerful message of the journey of addiction, hope, and shattering the shame. He's 30 plus years in recovery, as I said, and he is currently, and has been for a long time, the Vice President of Public Affairs and Community Relations at the Hazleton Betty Ford Foundation. And he's a New York Times bestselling author. His first book was Broken, which was a brilliant read. I think it's a must read for those of us who love people dealing with this disease. And his fourth book is about ready to be released in September of 2024. I can't wait to read his next book. So join us. Well, welcome. I just want to say, so blessed to have William Moyers with us today. He came through a circuitous route, which is very interesting always. And I reached out to him on LinkedIn, and lo and behold, this thing happened.
Yay.
So, and I read his first book called Broken, and quite frankly, it was illuminating on levels that I hadn't experienced before in reading a lot of the books that are out there in people's journeys. And I wanted to say thank you for writing that book to begin with. He is a New York Times bestselling author and has been very involved in the recovery community for a long time. I'm going to let him tell more of his story. But I think this is going to be a powerful conversation that you won't want to miss. So, William, if you would give us a little bit of background in your journey.
Well, thanks, Kale, for having me on, for recognizing that addiction is an illness of isolation, and the antidote to it is community. And here we are, the community of your viewers, your followers, and fellow travelers. It really is an honor for me to be with you. And I got to just tell you that I've got a lot of podcasts scheduled with the release of my new book in September, and you're the very first one. So hooray.
That's fantastic.
I am a man in long-term recovery from a substance use disorder. I smoked marijuana at the age of 15, and 15 years later, I was living and dying in a crack house in Harlem, New York. Those experiences chronicled in my first memoir, Broken, my story of addiction and redemption. The redemption part being about the fact that I did get better. I was able to access treatment 4 times over 5 years between 1989 and 1994. We know that addiction is a chronic, oftentimes relapsing condition. There's no cure for addiction. There is a solution. And fortunately, I found the solution, but it took me a couple of goes. I was blessed to have the opportunity to go to treatment 4 times. And in 1994, I found sustainable recovery after yet another relapse and ending up in a crack house in Atlanta, Georgia. I was in my mid-30s at that time, and I made it. I made it. I'd like to take some credit for that. And I guess I did take personal responsibility for managing my illness, but I think a lot of what happened to me was grace. Because how else can I explain it, particularly in the midst of an opioid epidemic in which thousands upon thousands of people continue to die, an epidemic of alcohol in which thousands upon thousands of people die and suffer. I made it. And then remarkably, 2 years after I emerged from that crack house in Atlanta, Georgia, I got a job at the Hazleton Foundation, as we were then called, based in Minnesota, where I live today in St. Paul. And I had worked at Hazleton, now called Hazleton Betty Ford. We merged with the Betty Ford Center back in 2014. I've worked there for 28 years, and I've been the public advocate for the organization, although I do a lot of other things too. My foundation is public advocacy. And for me, that means telling my story, not just the gritty, dirty, downward plunge of my story, but the
Hmm.
redemptive aspects of my
Right.
story, and the fact that addiction does not discriminate. And I have
Hmm.
used my platform, my own story, and the platform at Hazel and Betty Ford to really argue that while addiction does not discriminate, recovery shouldn't either. And yet it does. And there are too
Right.
many people who can't get access to treatment or can't get access to treatment again. So that in a nutshell is what I call the V-shaped recovery that represented by broken. I went down and then I went
Hmm.
up, right?
Hmm.
And
Hmm.
lived happily ever after, right? Well, not exactly. And we can talk about that, but that's sort of the basis of my new memoir, which will be out in September.
Fantastic. And so what I did so appreciate about your book was the window in,
Uh,
from a raw, incredibly intimate and real perspective. You had the blessing of a family that, kept reaching out,
yes.
to you, and not everybody does. I would say that, my story with Sam is similar in a little different ways, but having somebody or some buddies that love you in the midst of your disease is, I believe, so, so powerful. I talk about it as if, I wanted to be the thriving mama that my son popped out to on the other side
Yes.
in his recovery. And if or when, and that's holding the suspension of possibility.
Yes, yes. Well, KL, that's exactly right, and I appreciate your recognizing that I did have a supportive family, and I still do have a
Mm-hmm.
supportive family. There's a misconception around addiction that people who are addicts come from broken homes, or they lack faith, or they are people of other colors, or they live under bridges, or whatever it is. And there is a certain aspect to that that's true. But you know what? Addiction, as I said earlier, doesn't discriminate. And I lacked for nothing growing
Mm-hmm.
up,
Mm-hmm.
emotionally, morally, financially. I had it all, and I
Mm-hmm.
also had it spiritually. A lot of people think that addiction is a reflection on a lack of believing, and hardly. I mean, as you
Right.
know,
Mm-hmm.
my father is an ordained Southern Baptist minister. He went on to be the journalist Bill Moyers. But when I was born in 1959 in Fort Worth, Texas, my father was in seminary in Fort Worth, and my mother and he pastored a small church in Central Texas. The point being that I even had the spiritual or the faith
Mm-hmm.
part of that too. And so, despite all of those things, I had one of these, which is a brain that's vulnerable to substances.
Right. Right.
It doesn't. It's not an excuse, but it is an explanation. And I had what I call a hole in the soul, which aches with a sense of imperfection. And I filled that hole in the soul with substances. The only problem is those substances lit up this brain, which I could not turn off of my own free will.
Mm-hmm.
Fortunately, my family stuck with me. They hated what I did under the influence of my illness, but they
Right.
continued to love me. And I know to this day that
Mm-hmm.
I would not be here had my family not continued to love me, even through the ups and downs of my early journey.
Yeah. Yeah. I think from my side, that was probably one of the hardest things, was to, number one, recognize that who Sam is when he's doing drugs is
Yes.
completely not who he is. So
Right.
he's been hijacked,
Yes.
by the disease
Yes.
itself, which we can talk a little bit about. And to be able to kind of hold those two notions simultaneously is the hijacked Sam and the Sam that I know and love
Mm.
deeply and dearly. And then to be able to, as much as possible, witness the suffering of Sam in addiction and still hold the space for the rise out of the ashes.
Yes. Yes. Absolutely. And that's why I love what we were talking about earlier. I often tell families it's not your fault.
Right.
My parents, who are learned people, my dad's now
Mm-hmm.
90, my mother's 89, and they're struggling with end of life issues, but nevertheless, they're still around
Mm-hmm.
as of this recording. My parents wanted nothing but the very best for me.
Right.
And when things were not good, they suffered like I suffered. And
Right.
they had to take care of themselves, even
Yes.
when I was or wasn't taking care of myself. And what's very revealing about my first memoir, Broken, My Story of Addiction and Redemption, is that window into me and that window into my family was provided in part by the letters that my father wrote to me over the decades. Some of them related to my substance use issues, and some just to being a father and me being a teenager or a young adult at the time. And I was able to use those letters as a window into the family aspect of this illness and the impact that this illness can have, not just on the addict and the alcoholic or on your son, Sam, but on the family as well.
Right, exactly. And, there's enough parallels in our stories. I'm just a couple years older than you are. And I was born when my dad was in seminary, and we were both, Texas, I, was in the East Coast, and I have letters from my dad too. Wow. I was not the one who was dealing with substance use disorder. My brother was. But I was the oldest. And we're kind of considered the lost children because all the energy goes to the child who is dealing with substance use disorder. And my mom was addicted to prescription medications.
Oh,
so
really?
there was, so there was a lot of dysfunction in all of that. And so I think, my journey through it has been an evolution in decades. But Sam certainly was massively catalytic in propelling me into a much higher level of understanding this disease and who I was going to choose to be as a mom, evolving in my consciousness and my knowing about this disease and myself. So,
well, that's why as I said earlier, I always remind families they've got to take care of themselves, even if their loved one, their son, their daughter, their spouse, whatever, can't take care of themselves. And that can be really, really hard to do for families, particularly when the addict or the alcoholic is not recovering. But recovery is possible, not just for the afflicted, but for that family member as well.
Exactly. And so I'm curious, because you've had this, your own personal experience, obviously, but you have this institutional experience.
Yes.
And you have this national experience.
Yes.
And you have seen the evolution of this disease over decades now.
Yes.
Two things. One is, what are your top 3 recommendations to families that are kind of caught in the crosshairs of this and do not know how to navigate?
Oh, that's a good question, and we could expound on that for quite a long time. But I'll try to be succinct here. First, there is hope. Don't give up hope. Hope is the strategy. They often talk in business about hope is not a strategy, and I understand that. You got to have strategic plans. You got to put people in a room and figure that all out. But we don't have the luxury of that necessarily when we're dealing with the crisis of addiction. And what I would say to families is, hope is a strategy. There is hope. Hang on, stay in touch with, communicate with your loved one who is struggling. So that would be strategy number 1. Strategy number 2 would be set your boundaries. Set your boundaries, and that's often very, very hard to do. But addicts and alcoholics, oftentimes they don't respect boundaries because they either can't or they don't recognize them or they're not able to hoe the line, so to speak, or toe the line, so to speak. So if you're a family, set your boundaries. You can continue to love that person even as you hate the disease, but continue to love them, but don't let that person walk all over you. And then thirdly, or violate your boundaries. And then thirdly, this is directed primarily towards families who are fortunate to have health insurance. There was a time, in fact, when I wrote Broken back in 2006, there was not insurance parity for addiction or mental health. Now there is. And so even as your loved one continues to struggle, make sure you understand what your health policy covers for that day when your loved one is ready for treatment. You don't want to wait until that moment. You want to be prepared for that ahead of time. At Hazel and Betty Ford, there was a time we had a reputation that we treated the rich and the famous. And I guess we did treat some of them, yes. But when I went to treatment at Hazel in 1989, about 5% of our patients could use their insurance to access our system of care. Today, it's 95%. the point being that insurance is an important asset in this process of moving people from the problem to a solution. So that'd be my top three, I guess.
Okay. And where does the family program fit into this?
Well, yes, the family program is vital. And I would suggest to families, you can go to the family program even if your loved one hasn't gone to treatment. And you can go to the family program even after your loved one has left treatment. Because as I said earlier, you've got to recover no matter what happens to your loved one. But yes, whether it's a 12-step family program like Al-Anon or adult children of alcoholics programs, whether it's a formal family program like we have at Hazel and Bay Ford, you got to go. You got to take care of yourself, whether it's doing your daily meditations. And the good news post-pandemic is that you can oftentimes access these services virtually.
Right.
You can attend the family program virtually. Is it as engaging as being in the room with people? Maybe not, but it's still better than nothing. So family programs are really, really important for the family.
Yeah. I think there's several things I'm thinking about when you're talking about this. One is that kind of the mommy code. I'm just going to speak to the mommy code.
Yes.
Is that, we're supposed to fix them. We're supposed to help them. We're supposed to make this go away. And in my research and all of these things, it was learning that I'm not responsible. I can't control this. I can't fix this. And so learning to step back from the mommy code and recreate a code that really is more life-giving.
Yes.
To all parties concerned is part of the rewiring of how we think about this from a belief system and from a behavioral way of being a mom. And it requires you to change.
Yes. Change is hard. Change is really, really hard.
Yes. So it's not just, the person who's dealing with substance use disorder. We have to change too.
That's exactly right. And we have to change even if our loved one decides not to change.
Correct.
And sadly, that happens. I oftentimes, particularly over the last decade in this opioid epidemic, where over 100,000 people a year are dying, mostly from, we used to call it accidental overdose, but now we're calling it accidental poisoning. I oftentimes deal with families and a lot of moms, frankly, who have lost a loved one to this illness. And I say to them, so what are you doing for you? And they sort of look back off and say, well, what do you mean? My son or my daughter is dead. There's nothing that I'm doing for me. And I'm like, but wait a minute, you've got to take care of yourself. And that's true when your loved one is alive. And sadly, if you lose your loved one to this illness, that still doesn't mean that you shouldn't take care of yourself. So the healing process, as hard as it is as necessary for the addict and the alcoholic as it is for the family. And we can't emphasize that enough, KL.
It's the first question I ask when I talk to parents. What are you doing to take care of yourself?
Yes.
And they do the same thing with me, William. They're like, what?
What? Me?
Aren't we supposed to be fixing them?
Yeah.
And I was like, no, because the tentacles of this disease will pull you into the darkness.
Pull you into the darkness and can be just as debilitating as if, you were under the influence of the substance. In fact, you can argue that the parents or the siblings or the family is oftentimes as affected under the influence of the loved one's substance as if they were using it themselves. And I'll tell you this too, in my book, Broken, which is still in print 19 years later.
I know, I got it.
It's hard to believe.
It's awesome.
I got a copy of it right here, but the pictures in it show a family that was intact, and it shows my three children, Henry, Thomas, and Nancy, as much younger than they are today.
Right.
And in my new book, Broken Open, what painkillers taught me about life and recovery, I recount the reality that my children grew up between Broken and this new book, and the power of family, the role of parents in guiding our children as they grow up and oftentimes grow into the experience of substances. It really hits home in my new book because all three of my children ended up coming to me and asking for help when they too ran into a substance use issue.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, congratulations on that for them coming to you and asking for help. I think, that's one of the things I think parenting now is if we can teach our kids to ask for help when they need it, because they're going to need it, it's kind of mission critical in raising humans.
So I got to thank you for saying that, because my children, we talked about substance use issues around the table when my kids were little. How could we not? Their mother and I met in treatment in 1989. We are both alcoholics and addicts in recovery. We know the genetic predisposition. That my kids knew that Dad worked at Hazelland. They came up and picked me up on Friday afternoons when we'd go up to our cabin in Wisconsin, and they'd run around the grounds. They would go to 12-step meetings or conventions with us from time to time. So there was no denial in my family with my children about the reality of what substances were. We talked to them about being genetically vulnerable. And I said, kids, I'm going to incentivize you. I hope you'll wait until you're 21 to experiment, if you experiment at all. And that, of course, is because the brain is the last organ in the body to develop, and because the drinking age is 21. So I said, kids, I don't want you to break the law, and I don't want you to expose that vulnerable brain. And so if you wait until you're 21, I'll buy you a new car. That's what I told all three of my kids. Well, all three of my kids got to the age of 21. And I didn't have to buy any of them a new car because they all experimented. Which is why, thank goodness, I gave them one more tool in their toolbox. Not only did we talk about it, but we also said to them, it's okay to ask for help.
Yes.
And so I had one child come to me and ask for help. 2 years later, I had another child come to me and ask for help. And then I had my third child come to me and ask for help. And the amazing thing is, KL, today, all three of my children are recovering. They're recovering differently than I do. But there's no doubt that they're recovering from the desperate condition which led them to ask for help in the first place. And I think it's really important, particularly for us old timers who might favor one modality of recovery or one pathway to recovery, to recognize that today there are multiple pathways to recovery, and what was good for Moyers might be different for the offspring of the Moyers. And so I'm very fortunate that that all three of my children are better today because they were empowered to come to me and ask for help.
Congratulations.
Thank you.
You're welcome. So, how was that experience for you as a dad?
Well, I always thought it was hard to let go of substances. They talk about in 12-step recovery that you need to let go, right, of the substance. You got to admit you're powerless over the substance, and you got to turn it over and let it go. Well, I found that it was a lot easier to let go of substances than it was to let go of the people that I love. And there was an aspect of that I had to let go of how my children were doing it or not doing it for a while. My daughter is very open about this, so I can share this with you today. My daughter came to me and said, "Dad, I've been drinking to blackout since I was 14. And I was like, well, what do you mean you've been drinking at Blackhouse since you were 14? You're living up on the third floor of this house here. How can that be that I didn't know that? And I had some inklings, but I still didn't know it. So when you ask me how that was from a father perspective, you know what? I had a lot of shame around it. Shame is toxic in this illness, and it's true whether it's the addict or the alcoholic or the parent. So I had a lot of shame over the fact that I wasn't on top of my kids' use. And that I hadn't done a better job of keeping them away from it. Now it all worked out because I gave them that tool, but I had some shame. I had some anger. I had those natural feelings that not my child, goodness gracious. It was hard.
Yeah. So honestly, what did you do with that? Because you can't hang on to it.
No, you can't hang on to it. I found some relief in Al-Anon. Not all the relief I needed, but I found some relief in Al-Anon. I
Mm-hmm.
found some relief in giving myself permission to be an imperfect father.
Mm-hmm.
I found some relief in the fact that my children did come to me and ask for help. That sort of mitigated that shame that I had,
Yeah.
that
Yeah.
fear. I had fear that at least, especially my daughter, who was in deepest of all. By the way, my daughter today, she graduated from Columbia in New York City a year ago with her LMSW. She's a therapist and a counselor in New York City with 5 years of recovery. Uh,
Fantastic.
she recovers differently than I do, but she recovered.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So, so I had to be a parent. I had to accept that my children were going to do this differently than I was.
Yes.
That was hard. You know
Yeah.
that, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Yes. I think the control piece of this,
Yes.
personally, is probably one of the greatest things that we just have to break.
Yes. Hard though.
Um, uh, yeah, totally. And what I kind of came to was this notion of the mantra for me is loving Sam through his own unfolding.
Ah, yes.
And it's not my unfolding. It is uniquely his unfolding. I
Yes.
have my own unfolding in this.
Yes.
And so to be able to kind of step back from that and realize I'm a firm believer in that everything has a higher purpose.
Mhm.
And whatever his higher purpose is, or whatever, I don't begin to know what that is.
Right.
And so I need to stop pretending like I do.
Yeah.
And allow for his journey.
It's hard though to allow for somebody, especially when you know that they ought to go this way instead of that way, or that way instead of this way,
Yeah.
right? You think, I
Yes.
mean, and listen, as parents, we all want to do what's best, and we want what's best for our children. But
Mhm.
what I've had to realize as a parent to three children who grew up on me suddenly, it seemed, was that I need to let them find their own path.
Yes.
And I learned that because my parents, as loving as they have been to me now for 65 years, I turned 65 in May, as loving as they've been to me now for a long, long time, they tried to control me in ways that proved to be debilitating. And
Mm-hmm.
I don't want to suggest that I don't appreciate all that my parents did for me.
Mm-hmm.
But it took me a long time to sort of find my own way and to
Right.
exert my own muscle
Mm-hmm.
in finding my own way, because my parents had done so much for me. And when I would have a scrape with reality that wasn't very pleasant, they oftentimes tried to mitigate it. And I understood why they did that. But I think in some ways it was detrimental to what I needed. So when my own children had their issues, I loved them. I stayed connected to them. I made
Mm-hmm.
suggestions for them, but
Mm-hmm.
I had to let them go and find their way. And that is not
Mm-hmm.
easy for me.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I don't know any parent that's easy
Right.
for.
You're right.
I do think my experience has been it has become easier over lots of time
Yes.
and
Yes.
lots of intention on my part.
Yes.
And I mean, I live and breathe, a certain mantra, a certain way of being every morning. And, I'm very intentional about who I am in the world now and how I take care of myself.
Mhm.
And in the worst of times, every time something would happen, I'd be like, okay, I have to up my game. And so I think it's a continual evolution to be able to thrive in the midst of witnessing our children suffering.
And one way to do that, amen, is to, and I think the key for me is to accept the fact that I must remain teachable.
Mm-hmm. Yes,
You know,
yes, yes.
and that's hard when you
Mm-hmm.
have been taught, or
Mm-hmm.
that's to go this way or to recover that way. It's hard when
Mm-hmm.
you get to be an older person with a lot of wisdom. And that wisdom counts for a lot. I'm a lot wiser now than I was 5, 10, 15, 20 years ago by virtue of the fact that I'm that much older. But what I have learned, and I think that's reflected in my new book, Broken Open, is that I must remain teachable. And that's hard, but it's necessary. And I'd like to think that I actually have learned quite a lot since Broken came out about myself, about addiction, about treatment, about recovery, about parenting, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah. Well, and like you said, I mean, so much has happened over the decades. If we don't remain teachable, we're just going to keep, recycling this whole damn thing.
Yes.
And so that willingness to be teachable is, I know, they're mission critical piece, I believe, because there's still so much to learn. I mean, there's just been so much that has risen in the last 5 to 10 years in terms of understanding brain science and the hijacking of the brain. And, one of my really close, dear friends, when I pulled her aside, she was 34 years clean from meth. And I said, how can I support Sam in the midst of his addiction? And what she said to me was, you need to understand that when Sam comes to you for money, it is merely a transaction.
Yeah.
This is not about relationship building with you, Mom.
Yeah.
And if I don't give him money, it's like swipe left. That was revelatory to me. And so it's just, if we keep curious and keep exploring and keep talking to people like this conversation today, we keep kind of pushing out the edges of what we think we know into territory that before then was unknown to us.
That's also true in the organization that I work for, Hazel and Betty Ford. We have this is our 75th anniversary. You can't find too many other nonprofit treatment centers in America that have been around as long as we have been, since 1949. Wow. We started on a farm in Minnesota, and now we're a $240 million a year in revenue nonprofit, healthy nonprofit. We have facilities in 15 states, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But our organization as an institution, while we know that what we do is good, we have to remain teachable. And we have had to evolve to reflect the science, to reflect the dynamic of the family, to reflect the importance of a pharmacological approach to cravings or to mental health issues. And so the Hazel and Betty Ford of 1949 is not the Hazel and Betty Ford of today when it comes to many things. On the other hand, you don't want to be teachable for the sake of being teachable and throwing out the baby with the bathwater. So we're an organization that continues to embrace a holistic approach to the illness and to treatment for it. The 12 steps, which are just one of many pathways to recover, still hang on the wall of all of our facilities because that's a cornerstone of what we do. But particularly in the opioid epidemic, we've had, and particularly post COVID, we've had to be able to deliver virtual care, and we've had to be able to incorporate the use of anti-craving medications like buprenorphine or Suboxone to help our opiate-dependent patients get a better chance to recover. So if we hadn't remained teachable as an organization over these decades, we wouldn't be doing the job that we're doing today for our people.
Absolutely. And I just want to say congratulations. I have several friends that their kids in particular went to Hazleton and have had great results. And I understand, I have had several people that I know that have done the family program too. And so, yes, my hat is off to Hazleton and institutions like yours. We just don't have enough. I'm just going to say. And we're right up against the time. And so here's a couple things. One is I want to say thank you. And I want you to talk about your upcoming book that's coming out in September. But I also want to ask you if you would be willing to come back to continue this conversation with our audience.
I'd be honored. I can't believe the time's gone by as quick as it has. And I give you the credit for using your own sort of lived experience to get into my lived experience. And so thank you for that. Yeah, I've got this new book. It's a memoir called Broken Open, What Painkillers Taught Me About Life and Recovery. thus I ran into the Trojan horse of addiction, which is prescription pain meds about a decade ago. There I was with decades of recovery under my belt. I had a dental procedure. I was prescribed narcotic pain meds by doctors who knew who I was and where I worked.
Wow.
And it's not their fault that happened. It's reality that even I was vulnerable. And that experience taught me a lot about the pathways to recovery, the importance of using what science and medicine are giving us in terms of anti-craving medications. I think the new book is pretty good. It's being published by Hazel and distributed by Simon and Schuster. That's another story for another day about how that evolved. But I think the book is pretty good because it really takes people beyond broken. And allows people to see how in Broken I had to sort of live up to the story, but in Broken Open I get to live into the story. And I think there's a big difference for this hard-headed, peripatetic, recovering alcoholic.
Well, you just opened up a whole big can in talking about what do people do when they are recovering and they have to have procedures. And so that could be a topic for our next conversation. So if people want to get a hold of you, how do they do that?
It's real easy. Thank you for asking that. And by the way, because I'm so public about my story, because I've been an advocate for the organization for 28 years now, I get a lot of requests for help and I take every request seriously. I get on average about 3 requests for help a day, 360 days of the year. About half those people end up coming to Hazel, and the other half, I stick with them until they get to the Salvation Army or the XYZ Treatment Center or whatever.
Yeah.
I don't let go of people no matter who they are, or where they end up. People can reach me very easily at the Hazel and Betty Ford website, www.hazelandbettyford, all one word, .org. I answer my own email. I'll be doing a lot of speaking this fall when the new book comes out, but I'm very easy to find on the internet. I'm also on Facebook. I answer my own Facebook messages and I get a lot of requests through social media for help. So I'm easy to find, and it may take me a day or two to get back to you, but I'll get back to you.
Well, I just want to say, wow, like how actually remarkable you are. To be so entrenched in changing so many lives. We need more people like you. And so deep gratitude to who you are in the world. And your journey just opened up your calling for you.
Okay, Elle, thank you for saying that. That's my affirmation of the day. Maybe I'll make it my affirmation of the week, what you just said. I still live in a sense of wonderment that my life has worked out how it is. I am proof that from adversity comes opportunity, not just the adversity of addiction and the opportunity to overcome it, but the opportunity, like you've experienced, to give back, to help others through your podcast, through your work, through my books, through my work at Hazel and Betty Ford. Who'd have thunk it?
I know.
And so I wake up every morning and I say, thank you, God, for the gift of another day. Let me make the best of it. And when I go to bed at night, I say, thank you, God, for the gift of another day. I did my best today, and it works out.
Well, you did a great job today.
Thank you so much. Let's do it again.
Absolutely. We will do this again.
Okay. Thank you, Danielle.
You're welcome. I can't begin to tell you how excited I am to have had William Moyers. I'm deeply appreciative to you, William. You are a powerful voice and advocate in the space of addiction and substance use disorder and recovery. And we need you in this time because of your experience and because of your perspective and because of who you are as a change maker in this world. Thank you.